I'm Jessica Leno, the Stanford King Center on Global Development's Executive Director, and we are Stanford's multidisciplinary research hub for work on global poverty and development. We also train the next generation of global thinkers and host conversations like this one on important topics in development. And before we get started today, I just wanted to acknowledge our outreach partners for this event. We have the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research, the Walter Schorstein Asia Pacific Research Center, the US Asia Technology Management Center, and Stanford Seed. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce our moderator for today's speaker series on the future of the Indian economy. We have Nicholas Bloom, who is the William Erbel Professor of Economics at Stanford. He's also a fellow at both the King Center and CTIER. He is the co-director of the Productivity, Innovation, and Entrepreneurship Program at the National Bureau of Economic Research, and his research focuses on management practices and uncertainty. I'll turn it over to Nick now, who will introduce the rest of the panelists. Thank you.
So thanks very much, Jessica. This is a fantastic panel. It also is a panel filled with our kind of friends and colleagues of Stanford. So why don't I go through it? So first we have Rohini. Rohini Chakravarthy is the managing partner at NewBuild Venture Capital, where she invests in early stage enterprise and supply chain software companies. Rohini has served on more than 15 boards as an investor board member and has shepherded many companies through exponential growth, successful acquisitions, and IPOs. Rohini is also a member of Indiaspora, which is a community platform to shape successful US-Indian relations. Rohini's also a long family friend going back 10 years, and I think we first met when she took a bunch of our middle school kids, so my daughter, her son, a bunch of other kids to the movie. They all went to see Kung Fu Panda 3. So, the most impressive thing is Rohini sat through Kung Fu Panda 3. So I think in the Q&A session, if there are any questions on Kung Fu Panda 3, it goes to Rohini. Second, we have Naushad. So Naushad, welcome back to Stanford. Naushad Forbes is the co-chairperson of Forbes Marshall, India's leading process and energy efficiency company. He is the chair of the Center for Technology, Innovation, and Economic Research, CTIER, which is the leading innovation research think tank in India, and is working with us on this project. Naushad has long been an active member of the Confederation of Indian Industry and was their president in 2016 to 2017. He is the author of The Struggle and the Promise, Restoring India's Potential. Most importantly, Naushad received his bachelor's, his master's, and his PhD degrees from Stanford. So I was thinking about it. I think if he went on to get an MBA, JD, and ND, he'd have the complete bingo of the Stanford degree. So he's doing incredibly well. Naushad and I first met almost 20 years ago when there was a conference. I remember Farhad, who is here, Farhad. Here we go. It was over in the economics department. In fact, this was when this building, before the beautiful King building was built, was actually a car park. I don't know if anyone else can remember it. I also remember it was $3 a day to park your car here, so that wasn't really doing much for the, for Stanford's finances. And now we've been definitely upgraded to this building. And finally, Megha. Megha Patnaik is an assistant professor in the Department of Economics and Finance at LUISS in Italy. It's a university in Rome. And she is a research affiliate at the Center for Economic Policy Research. Previously, she was faculty at the Indian Statistical Institute and a data science consultant at Intuit. Perhaps most importantly, Megha also holds a PhD from Stanford. And they dug this out earlier today. I have to show it, which is the photo from Megha's PhD defense, which is exactly 7 years ago today. So, I thought, exactly. And Megha, so going forward, the setup is Megha's going to talk for about 20 minutes. She's going to present a research project that a number of us have been involved in. We'll then go to Naushad and Rohini. We'll talk for about 5 minutes each, more generally on the future of the Indian economy. We'll then go to open Q&A. In the Q&A, I think if it's a question on the research presentation, we'll steer it towards Megha. If it's a broader question on India economy, the US economy, I tend to steer it towards Naushad and Rohini. And with that, I will hand over to Megha. Okay.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Nick, for the introduction. Not only have we not aged, but I'm wearing the same shirt, so we haven't gone shopping either. So what I'm going to present on today is essentially going to be summarizing some of the studies that Nick, me, and other collaborators have done on measuring management and how it relates to firm performance. So we can think what bad management looks like. It could look like something from Charlie Chaplin's Modern Times, where there are fights breaking out on the assembly line, or there are people getting swallowed up by the machinery during the lunch break. We also have an intuitive understanding of what good management can look like. So here, like Star Trek, everyone's sitting in their places, wearing their uniforms, and doing their designated jobs. And I'm sure all of you in different industries and different workplaces have experienced this, understand this intuitively, what good and bad management can look like. But what we want to think about is how do we measure this systematically, right? And academic economists have been interested in management and how this drives firm performance for a very long time. So Francis Walker, who was the founding president of the American Economic Association and ran the 1870 and 1880 censuses, wrote all the way back in 1887 that management was a major source of performance differences across US firms. Since 1887, we haven't had much empirical evidence, much hard data on management. So there's a lot of anecdotal evidence. There's lots of books at SFO on management that sell very well. But as Chad Syverson says, we don't have, for any potential driving factor of productivity, a higher ratio of speculation to empirical study. So what Nick, me, other collaborators, what we've done over the past years has been to try and measure management quantitatively. I'm going to talk about two of these studies. The first is the World Management Survey, and the second is the Management and Organizational Practices Survey. These were done in collaboration with governments, with statistical agency, or with policy organizations, and try to quantify this concept of management that we all understand intuitively. Specifically, what I want you to keep in mind is that we're not thinking about management style, we're thinking about management practices. So here's an example of that. This is from an auto parts factory we visited a few years ago. And you can't see here, or maybe you can. This company supplies gearboxes to Tata, to Mahindra & Mahindra, and so on. And they have a very clearly displayed board which tracks whether they're meeting the targets and dispatching the orders. On the other hand, you can imagine there are other factories. This is a textile mill from one of Nick's visits, which you cannot find the production board anywhere in this picture, right? And so this is essentially what we want to quantify. To what extent do firms have these practices in place? These are practices based on lean manufacturing principles, for example, in management consulting, that are well understood to drive firm performance, but yet companies don't have these in place. So this is what we're trying to get at. And what we can do is you can go visit the factory and so on, but you can also just ask the firm. And so the World Management Survey was the first such attempt to simply ask firms, do you have these practices in place, and be able to quantify management. So how this was run was based on a phone interview, which was about 45 minutes long with a senior manager. Basically, the interviewer has a McKinsey-style scorecard for 18 questions, 18 topics on monitoring, targets, and people practices. Okay, so monitoring can be monitoring the production process. Targets can be short-term, long-term, do you meet your targets? People practices can be how you hire, fire, promote workers. And through the phone interview, the interviewer would score the managers and effectively, depending on the respondent, effectively score the firm on the presence of these management practices or structured management practices within the firm. Over the years, the World Management Survey has been run for 25,000 companies across 38 different countries. So first of all, what have we learned from this? We've learned that there's a wide variation in management across countries. So the average company in the United States or Japan or Germany is adopting a lot of these practices in their firms or their factories, whereas countries in Asia, so Asia is shown here in red, and Africa. Africa is shown here in yellow. You can see here that in these in countries there, you find that companies are not picking up these structured management practices as much. India also, we find that the average firm in India in the sample is not having these practices in place very much. However, what we also learn is that there's a wide variation of the adoption of these practices in countries themselves across firms. So for example, if you look here at the graph for India, you see a wide variation in the extent to which companies are picking up these practices. Also for the US, so even in the US, although you find that the distribution is shifted to the right compared to India, the overall distribution, however, you find that even in the US, there's a widespread of management. Particularly for India, what we're optimistic about, and I'm going to talk about later in the presentation, is that there are going to be high-performing firms in India that we argue are going to be the ones that are going to drive growth moving forward. So you can imagine that this phone survey is essentially quite involved. You need a skilled interviewer to be able to do this survey. So typically, the interviewer has an MBA. It's a 45-minute interview. Essentially, this sort of instrument is less scalable than you would as you can imagine. And so what we did next was try to convert this open-ended phone interview into a close-ended questionnaire, which can be essentially scaled up. So that was the Management and Organizational Practices Survey. We did this along with the US Census Bureau. And this was a 16-question module. So we adapted all the information that you would measure in the World Management Score to close-ended questions, again on monitoring targets and incentives. And I'm going to get to some examples in the next slide. This was administered to more than 47,000 manufacturing establishments or factories in 2011. Now, relative to the WMS, this survey is quick, it's easy to fill out, and the census surveys, you have to respond by law, okay? So it says your response is required by law. Now, that generated 78% of factories responding, which is what you might not expect if it's required by law, especially in the US. But this is better than any kind of response rate that you can imagine in a firm survey. This covers more than 50% of US manufacturing employment. So let me get to the 3 dimensions that we want to look at. So we want to look at monitoring, targets, and incentives using close-ended questions. So a question on monitoring can be, how many key performance indicators do you measure in your factory? A question on targets can be, what best describes the time frame of your targets? And in terms of incentives, you could ask, for non-managers and for managers, how are performance bonuses determined? Is it based on individual performance, team performance, or the company's performance overall? What we do after the respondents receive this questionnaire is that they check off whatever response applies best to them, and then we score them individually on each question. So for example, if you look at the first question, if you did not track any key performance indicators, then you would get a score of 0 on that question. If you tracked 10 or more, you would get a score of 1. And if you had something in between, you would get a score of something in between. So we score individual questions, we take an average, and we land up with a management score. Now, because these surveys were done with the census or with statistical agencies or central banks or government agencies, we don't just have a measure of management, we also have more characteristics for the firm. So we have, in addition, we have factory-level data or firm-level data on the ownership, on the usage of IT, on performance metrics such as sales, sales growth, productivity, profitability, and so on. This is either collected through the management survey itself, but sometimes, as you know, firms are not very responsive if you ask them questions on financials, as you can imagine. And so often this is through linking other microdata sources. Because this survey was so adaptable, today the survey has been run in 15 different countries by statistical agencies or by the central banks. And we have data for all of these, and we're able to look at trends overall. So What I want to talk about especially is that we actually are running this survey in India. So we call this the Indian Management and Growth Survey. We're also looking at innovation. It's a very exciting project. On the team, there's me, there's Nick, there's Pete Kleno, there's Mert, who's somewhere here in the audience. Where's Mert? Hi, Mert. And then we have Janak, who's heading CTIER. So CTIER is the Center for Technology, Innovation, and Economic Research. If you're interested in innovation or innovation policy, then this is your go-to place. It's a fantastic team. They have a very long-term perspective on India, and it's a great place. They bring out a handbook, so you can basically track the Indian economy from the dimension of innovation if you're interested. We have supervisors for the survey team. We have Chaitanya, we have Nishok, and we had other participants who were with us when we were doing the piloting and the factory visits for the survey as well. So how do we do the survey? Essentially in Pune, at the center at CTIER, we have a team of enumerators, okay? And we develop this survey through factory visits, through cognitive testing. Like you always want to make sure that respondents understand the question in that context. Are they willing to answer it? And so we have the survey and we have the enumerators, and the survey is ongoing right now, as you can see. And of course, we're very, very serious about measuring management. So we also measure the performance of the enumerators themselves. So we have a board saying, how many interviews did you do this week, and so on. And essentially, they're given little prizes if they perform well, which I think is fantastic. It's going great. So what do we learn from the World Management Survey, the US census-based MOPS, other country MOPS, and India MOPS? I'm going to try and talk about that a bit. The first thing we learn is that better managed firms are generally bigger in size, whether you look from the perspective of inputs, the number of employees, or you can look at the perspective of outputs or the revenue. Over here, I'm showing the graph for India, but this is true also in other countries, for the US. For many other countries, we find the same pattern, that management is associated with larger firm size. We think this is because essentially better managed firms can expand in competitive markets. But of course, we know that markets are not always competitive, right? So depending on the country or depending on the environment, we actually find that there's differences in this management size relationship. And you can see that in countries where you have the US, you have Denmark, you have a stronger relationship between management and size than you do in countries where you don't have much of a market economy. For example, Russia, you have a lower relationship between management and size, suggesting there are lots of frictions for these better managed firms possibly to grow. India falls somewhere in between. We're very optimistic because, as you can see, it means that there is some ability for well-managed firms to grow in the Indian business environment. In addition to size, well-managed firms also perform well on any other metric that you can think about. So whether it's productivity, profitability, output growth, exporting, these firms are performing better. Specifically, well-managed firms are also innovative, so they have more patenting per worker, more R&D intensity, and so on. We find this for India as well. But essentially, the measure of patents and R&D may not be the measure that you want to look at in India. So in our survey, we specifically also ask about product innovation because we think this might be a better measure. Patenting depends on your incentives to patent. Your propensity to report R&D will determine the R&D if that's the measure. But if you directly ask about product innovation, then you capture a lot of firms introducing new products to the market, improving products that they already had, so their own product portfolio, whether they are earning from selling identical products, new products, improved products, or products that they adapt from their competitors into their own business. And what we find that even in addition to better managed firms being more innovative in terms of R&D and patenting, we find that even on product innovation, better managed firms perform better. So what you can see is that with management, you have a higher share of sales from products new to the market. from improving products, and you have a lower share of sales from selling the same product as you did last year. And there's no relationship between management and essentially imitating products that are already there in the market. In addition to size, performances, we described innovation. We also find, in work I did with the Bank of Italy, that better managed firms are more resilient to shocks. So essentially, if you look at the lockdown in Italy, you find that firms who were above the average management score had lower decline in sales performance. And if you look at why this happened, they do a whole bunch of things. So they basically change their way of reaching customers. They change their vendors. They adapt very quickly to the shock. And so what we find is that management essentially matters not only in normal times, but also in responding to extreme events. Now, suppose we understand this and we all agree that we know what these management practices are, we know they matter for performance, then why is it that firms are not adopting them? And so I just want to point out a couple of key factors that we've understood that are relevant, especially to India. It could be a push factor or a pull factor for why firms can, how firms can improve their management. The first is skill. So what we find in general across studies, here particularly for the US, is that you need a skilled workforce to be implementing these management practices. So if you have a higher percentage of employees with a college degree, whether they're non-managers or managers, you'd find that essentially the management score goes up with skill, right? This is particularly important for India because we have a demographic advantage, but we do want to skill the population to be able to make the most of it. Another dimension which can help improve management is that high-performing firms have spillovers in the sense that they generate investment, they generate employment, and they improve the management of the local incumbent firms that are there. So here's an example. Boeing has recently opened its biggest campus outside of the US in Bangalore. And already this is spurring innovation and so on. So we anticipate that there'll be much more investments like this, either from multinationals or from Indian firms or Indian multinationals as well. And this is going to be a major driver of management and of performance. Finally, we have a report out. So we have a cricket theme so that you would get confused, and it's a bait and switch for you to read about management. But the point we want to make is that essentially, if you have a few high-performing firms, they can drive up your aggregate productivity. If you want to learn more about that, read the report. Here's the QR code for that. Thank you so much, and I'll pass on to Naushad and the panel.
Naushad, do you want to talk for 5 minutes maybe, and then Rohini, and then we'll go to Q&A?
Sure. So first of all, thank you very much, Jessica and Nick, for the opportunity to be back on campus. I don't need much of an excuse, so it's always good to have one. It's also good to know that management matters, especially given that that's what I've done for most of my career. So, and it's, I think, particularly valuable to have how it matters. And what are the kinds of factors and elements that actually contribute to higher productivity and better overall performance. So I thought in these few minutes, I'd just make a couple of comments more broadly about the Indian economy and then on manufacturing specifically. So, as you would all know, India's been one of the world's 10 best performing economies in the last 30 years in terms of per capita GDP growth. And every projection says we'll be one of the world's 10 best performing economies in the next 30 years, again, in per capita GDP growth. The point I'd make is that it's very easy to get satisfied with that and say that's good enough. But India, it seems to me, should actually aspire to be the world's best performing economy in the next 30 years in terms of per capita GDP growth. And we should aim to grow not at the 6 to 7% that we've been averaging since 1991, but instead at 8, 9, 10% year on year for the next 20 to 30 years, which is what, as you would all know here, Japan averaged in the 50s and 60s, South Korea and Taiwan averaged in the 60s and 70s, and China has averaged since roughly 1980 to now. And that should be our aspiration, that how do we grow at 8, 9, 10% year on year for a generation? What will that take? It seems to me that it will take two things. First, it means that we have to get employment right. India's seen significant growth in employment in these last 30 years, but most of the growth in employment has been in informal services. It's not been in manufacturing. People have moved out of agriculture, but to a much lesser extent than in most other developing countries that have grown rapidly. And as they've moved out of agriculture, they've moved into informal services. These informal services have been much more productive than the relatively low productivity agriculture that they came from, but it's not as productive, certainly in terms of, in a dynamic sense, in being able to raise productivity in the long run, as it would be if they had moved into manufacturing. Manufacturing, even of the low-performing manufacturing firms that the survey finds. Even the lowest performing manufacturing firm, I would guess, would have multiple productivity jumps relative to the average productivity that we see in agriculture in India. So it would still be a jump. To give you an indication of how impactful that could be, if you look at the average productivity of the manufacturing sector in India, if the entire Indian workforce of 400 some million had the productivity of the average manufacturing firm in India, India would be as rich as South Korea today. So it would be about 15 times richer than it is now. So that in itself would give you this huge jump in productivity. It's what manufacturing can actually do for the Indian economy. So how do we get employment right? We need to worry both from a supply perspective and a demand perspective. From a supply perspective, we need to worry about the quality of education, particularly the quality of school education and the education outcomes that many researchers like Anjani have studied for years. And how do you get better education outcomes for the wider school system in the country? Something to talk about, but I'll just flag that as the key supply factor, if you ask me, in terms of long-run productivity growth in the Indian economy. We also have to get demand right, and that's creating millions and millions of better quality jobs than these informal service jobs that we've been creating. So creating jobs in labor-intensive manufacturing, an area where we have not done well as a country, and creating jobs in tourism, where we have also not done as well as a country as many others around us have. And we can maybe get into some of this later on. If we get those two things right, if we get the supply right in terms of improving education outcomes, and if we get demand right in terms of creating millions of better quality jobs, I think India can grow at 8, 9, 10% for the next 30 years. I think that's the big single factor. A last comment on manufacturing specifically. If you look at the industrial sector in India, we have, as many have pointed out, a more skill and capital intensive industrial structure than most countries at India's level of per capita GDP. And various historical reasons why we have a more skill and capital intensive industrial structure. But given that skill and capital intensive industrial structure, for India and Indian industry to grow in a much more dynamic and vibrant and rapid way over the next 30 years, Indian industry needs to invest a lot more in R&D and in innovation than it does now. So I'll quibble a little, because you made the comment that maybe patents and R&D investments are not the right metric. I would argue that they need to be, and that R&D and investments in R&D and in innovation needs to become a much more mainstream part of what good management in India actually involves. If you look at the overall numbers, Indian industry invests about 0.3% of GDP in in-house R&D. The world average is 1.5%. That's also the number for China. So we need to scale our investments in in-house R&D by a factor of 5 to match the world average. And I think for us to have a long-term, vibrant manufacturing sector, innovation needs to be much more a key part of the long-run strategy of Indian industry. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much. Awesome. And Rohini, thank you.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I think, really fascinating presentations. Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me, Nick. So I guess in my case, my entire career I've been investing in startups, both as a corporate investor, so in terms of how companies look outside for innovation and how do you build these ecosystems. So I was at Intel Capital for 7 years and was part of Nokia's venture arm for several years. Little louder, okay. I will. Yeah, and then as well as I was part of NEA, which is a large venture firm, and part of the NEA India investment practice for many years. So most of my experience, so I'll kind of comment on the specific rather than the general. So I think in terms of the innovation economy, one of the things that I've observed is over the last, so I've been investing in India for the past, coming on 20 years now. And if you look at the company formation, the quality of entrepreneurship, the types of ideas and the aspirations of startups and entrepreneurs, there is a dramatic difference. And I think the words that I like to use are leapfrog. I think people are, at least on the entrepreneurial level, they're very much focused on kind of catching up with the Western economies, not too worried about where they start, but really how do you actually go where the puck is going. And I think India has this young population, high energy, full of joy. So when you see the startup ecosystem, you actually experience that there are big dreams and big aspirations. There are also sort of pointers along the way on building on top of what has come before. So in the software sector, for example, I think broadly, I think if you look at the startup ecosystem, you can put it in 3 buckets. There is one which is India Global SaaS, which maybe chronologically came first. And then the second was India for India. So there's this burgeoning India stack, which is a public-private partnership in terms of having these innovation rails that the private industry can build on. And then the third is India, or they call it Bharat Deep Tech these days, right, which is about space and clean tech and manufacturing in India and so on. So, and startups are actually trying to build on all three of those sectors. In the first one, which is the global SaaS, the precursor are the IT services companies that came before. So you look at Infosys and TCS and Wipro and so on. That's an export-led market, right? So it's 200 billion in revenue to India. 80% of that is exports. And I think the startups that are forming today want to be product equivalents of the Infosys of the world. And they feel like, okay, I can get 200 billion in revenue from here. And today, if you look at where Indian startups are, there are only, I think 10 or 11 Indian startups that have over 100 million in SaaS ARR. So it's still very, very small. But the aspiration is, how do I get to $200 billion in revenue? And I think capital is part of that conversation, but you also need to have, along the way, in terms of the investment in education that you mentioned, Naushad, I think what is really positive about that sector is that there are now 13 million developers in India, right? So that has become a talent pool in itself, world-class developers there. And I think one of the reports that I just read is, if you look at Indian developers, 80% of them say they use AI now, because you would think that AI would replace Indian developers, because there's this question on what type of job replacement happens. But the Indian developer set, they are going to co-opt this. So you're going to be, other people are going to compete with that workforce that's already employing AI. If you look at sort of the GitHub repositories, 25% of the contributions to AI open source comes from India, right? So there is, these high aspirations are starting to be matched with high ability, and at least at that level. It's not, of course, it doesn't solve the problem for 1.5 billion people, but in that small population, there is an aspiration to be like world class, and that excellence is there. The second bucket, which is the India stack, is partially borrowed from, you have the cloud rails that's shared with the US stack, right? So there's AWS, and if you have WhatsApp and Facebook, all of and Google are, unlike in China, let's say, it's not a separate stack. There is a connectivity with the US stack, but there's also been a huge investment in low-cost cellular connectivity, identity, which is through Aadhaar, with UPI, and startups are now able to build on top of that. And so if you look at just the recent quarterly numbers, 2/3 of investment in India goes to startups building around kind of the Indian consumer economy. So it's fintech, e-commerce, internet-enabled services. These are all the things that startups want to build around. And then the third one, which is aspirational, is the latest numbers. It's still 10% of startup investments goes to deep tech. About 20%-ish goes to global SaaS, but 10% to deep tech. I think that is where people are trying to figure out it's a mission-driven environment for India. You want to have this Mars rover. You got Mangalyaan 2. The joke was that India put the Mars rover up for less than the US made the movie Martian. And so, there is this focus on efficiency. How do you leapfrog with, but it's like simple living, high thinking type of principles. And I think there is, you mentioned the Boeing hub. People are working on, projects that matter, like into the real world. So I feel like those puzzle pieces are in place. There is still a long ways to go on capital formation to be able to support all of these things. But there certainly is, I think there is the talent pool and urgency that, it makes for a very positive environment whenever I go to India and interact with startups. Last point on, the management, really interesting. So what we feel is that the whole startup ecosystem is a different form of management development as well, right? I think it is a risk-based, it's focused on growth rather than size per se. Like you're focused on growth, but the way you get that growth is by actually de-risking one by one. So typically startups start with de-risking technology risk, and then they have to de-risk product risk. And then there's this whole product market phase where you try to align what you have kind of come up with, the new thing you've come up with on market demand. And then there is scale-up risk, right? So startups do need to build management skills to go with the de-risking on each of those. And there, I feel there is a huge X factor for India, which is there is this, Nick, you mentioned, I've been part of Indiaspora. I feel like there are this, it used to be India thought of people leaving India to come to the US as a brain drain. I think, increasingly people talk of it as a brain bank, right? Which is there are all these role models, people who are managers at the highest levels. 17 of the Fortune 500 CEOs are Indian Americans. I think people are kind of aspiring to learn from the best and bring those practices back to India, adapt them to the Indian situation. So I'm very positive, very bullish about what's to come, and what I'm observing are kind of the small companies and how they're going about building in India.
Great, okay.
Thank you.
So there's a fantastic manufacturing-focused and then tech and service-focused, take. Very, very positive as well. In fact, interestingly enough, this morning I was having a call with some folks at MasterCard. I've been working with MasterCard, looking through some of their data, and travel is totally rebounded. In fact, they were saying the second biggest growth in global travel has been India-US. So India-US has seen an explosion. There's many more domestic routes, but they see, India and US, the increase in India and US was bigger than the increase from the next 9 routes. It was huge. So I'm going to throw the floor open to questions. There's already, I was about to say, if I was teaching MBAs, because it's class participation graded, like every hand is up, but there's already, would you like, why don't you go first? If we have a roving mic, thanks.
Does this work? Okay, so my question is to Dr. Forbes. So on the question of whether we should try to, as India, push a large number of jobs into like manufacturing, because there's much more scope for productivity improvements there. I've noticed also like a recent strain of skepticism on whether India should do this through manufacturing or whether we are sort of forced to relegate this through some sort of like more labor-absorbing services. So, Roderick has been warning of premature deindustrialization for decades, where he says things like automation and technological improvements in the West mean it's very hard to find massive export markets for manufacturing in developing countries anymore. So Roderick and Stiglitz had a paper around in the last year where they argued that, in fact, a lot of these small, sometimes informal labor-absorbing services are one of the only ways developing countries can create jobs. And then recently in the Indian context, we've had Raghuram Rajan and Rohit Lamba come out with a similar argument where they say, ideally we would want jobs in manufacturing, but it seems unattainable, especially with like technological progress and automation and so on. And so this premature deindustrialization problem means we have to find a way to work and improve the productivity of services. So what do you think of that argument? Is there hope for manufacturing? Like, do we have the capability to, even if we would really like to?
Sure. Do you want to take?
No, what do you go ahead?
Okay, so first of all, I think there is hope for manufacturing. And I appreciate what Raghuram Rajan and Rohit Lamba have argued in their book about making the case for services. Where I disagree is, I think arguing the case for services in place of manufacturing, I disagree. In addition to manufacturing, I have no problem. Yes, we should be pursuing services. That's where we're creating jobs. The question is, what is the quality of the job that's being created? And how do you actually put literally millions of people to work in decent quality jobs? So when we talk about deindustrialization, if you look at what's happening in the world, I'm not sure that we're actually seeing deindustrialization happen. As we see jobs to some extent in lower wage jobs move out of China, it's not that they've been replaced with automation. It's that they've moved to Vietnam, they've moved to Bangladesh. Why have they not moved to India? And I think that's the argument that one should be worrying about. That if, for example, Bangladesh, our neighbor, can create, as they have, millions of jobs in the garment sector, where 80% of employees are actually women, giving Bangladesh a much higher female labor force participation ratio, for example, than India has, why can't that be done right across the border in West Bengal, in Assam? There's no good reason why not. There's a mindset, it seems to me, in India. There's labor laws and so on which need to be addressed, but there's a mindset among Indian entrepreneurs that employing a lot of people is a bad idea. In services, less of that mindset. In manufacturing, very much a mindset that's set in as a result of fairly restrictive labor laws for maybe 50 years. And even as the laws have been relaxed, that mindset lingers on. So I think that mindset will need to change. We're starting to see the first beginning signs of that change. For example, you have now, as a result of various schemes and so on, the start of large-scale, labor-intensive manufacturing in electronics and electronic assembly, in particular, the assembly of phones. So the Tatas, for example, have invested now in 3 plants that now employ about 40,000 people, going to around 200,000 people in around 3 years. It's the first example of large-scale, labor-intensive manufacturing we've seen in the country, the first example. And if we have a few more of those, I think then it could start to attract followers, other Indian entrepreneurs who will see the potential in labor-intensive manufacturing. I think that's all it takes. It will take that shift in mindset among Indian entrepreneurs, and then a supportive policy environment to support labor-intensive manufacturing. Yeah?
Okay, take it. Someone right at the back there. Yeah, thanks.
I just had an open question about the semiconductor mission that you just touched upon. So I know that you mentioned how Tata's has been getting into it. I was wondering why there hasn't been much participation from venture capital when it comes to production of semiconductors in India.
Well, it's hugely capital intensive. So I think there is definitely there's a desire now, especially with the new geopolitics, to secure those supply chains. And and in my current firm, I'm entirely focused on supply chain software, and the geopolitics is actually a big part of it. I think in general, like even in the U.S., there was a semiconductor winter for 20 years, right? As a lot of the semiconductor design and new companies formation moved to China in the 2000s and 2010s. I think only with this new AI buzz, it has come back to the U.S. even for design. There is a huge dependency, even in the U.S., on TSMC, right? So TSMC is now opening a factory in Arizona. So there is this now a concentrated effort on how do we secure that entire part of so IP, design, as well as manufacturing. In India, I think there have been some MNCs that have been in India, but for the most part, India has not had very much success with manufacturing. In the 80s, there was an attempt to build a manufacturing facility in Chandigarh, right? And I think there was a huge fire in that factory. So even though I think the design talent exists in India, or could exist in India, there really hasn't been a comparative advantage. So if you look at people who could work on chips or work on software, if you're a developer, you pick software, you have many more opportunities. I think so. It is more of a mission-driven culture. But I think this current effort, there's a semiconductor policy mission. Applied Materials has been big. The Tatas have been big in terms of the new chip effort. But it does take a lot to create that.
Okay. Question? Yeah.
When we start talking about manufacturing versus services, and I'm guilty of having started the software services revolution in the 70s, so I have a bias. But I still have a question. I think the right way to answer that question is to turn around to the countries that are highly automated, like the US, and say, where will the less skilled people be working? Mm-hmm. And if you can't answer that, then it's not fair to ask India that question, because the problem is only compounded by the size. It's not changed. So let me ask that question. Where do you see American manufacturing going? Because that will give us clues as to where these opportunities exist. I personally believe that healthcare services, where the equipment is made in India, as it is largely done, and the services are delivered in India, is going to be the next big growth area that will match software service. It will be another 200 billion. But it is not a manufacturing versus services. It's both. There are people making the equipment, and there are people delivering the services. And that combination is what's going to attract people. But I come back to my question. Where does the panel think American manufacturing opportunities are going to be for the people who are not today employed? And if we don't have an answer to that, then I'm afraid we are really stymied.
American manufacturing for the...
You should take that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to put... you can hear from my accent, I'm not about to be an expert in American manufacturing. So, American manufacturing has been, if you look at the employment numbers, it was pretty cataclysmic. Yeah. From about 2000 to 2010. It shed something like half of employment. It is, since 2010, slowly recovered. As a share of employment, it's still doing, because the overall growth force is growing larger. Interestingly, US manufacturing on value added looks fantastic. Mm-hmm. So what's happening in the US is we're making billions of dollars of output, but with very few people. Why? Because any manufacturing plants that require a lot of people have just moved overseas. there is a lot of fear in discussion right now about AI is taking all our jobs and various other, robots are stealing our jobs. It also happens in the US. We have, epically low levels of unemployment, very high rates of labor force participation rates. So currently in 2024, there isn't particularly a shortage of jobs. There are still more openings than unemployed people. The ratio of openings to unemployed people is above 1. I am personally somewhat more concerned looking 20 years out. 20 years, you could see AI and robots and things generate potentially technological unemployment. Having said that, as an economist, going all the way back, Malthus onwards, people have talked about technological unemployment. It's never yet come. So when when the motor car came along, people said, "Oh, it'll throw all these people out of work," and the Luddites. But it could come to pass. So I'll end there with my comment on my adopted country, I guess, at this point. But
I'll just add a very quick comment, which is very anecdotally, 2 friends of mine have Indian industrialists have plants in the US. What they've really struggled with is hiring anyone to work in those plants on the shop floor. They've really struggled. So in terms of where are the manufacturing jobs going to come from? Well, one needs people who want manufacturing jobs first. And I'm not sure that exists at present in the US because of the very tight labor market.
So I was actually going to ask Rohini if she sees tech is generating enormous amounts of value in India. Do you see it generating enormous amounts of employment? Or is it more of...
It's a good question.
Yeah, I mean, I think the scale is off, right? So, you look at it's millions of people, I guess, I don't know, what is the organized sector in India is like 50 million.
Half of the population is self-employed.
Yeah.
So
it's hard to tell because if the new thing.
Organized manufacturing in India?
No, the organized workforce itself.
The organized workforce is about 50 million.
People,
50 million, out of which manufacturing would be 20.
Yeah, and 13 million are developers. So I think on the scale of the organized, it has grown to be a reasonably high part of the organized sector, but. But I think that pool is also, the thing with AI is that it goes after both the very highly skilled and sort of very low skilled workforce. So right now the buzz here in the Valley is all about how with AI you can build enormous companies with very few people. Like you look at the the arguments around Meta or Twitter and so on. They've been able to take out 60% of the developers, and you sort of still get the same value. So I think that is going to be sort of a balancing force in India, where if you want to keep up on the AI revolution, there might be many more companies formed. Your people are talking about how most companies will actually be pretty small. You won't need to grow the people count to build large companies, at least in the software world. So it's hard to tell.
Got it. Thank you.
John has a question.
Oh, John. Yeah. Sorry.
This is maybe a little off. Maybe this is not the quite focus of the panel, but I am kind of curious your view. In my reading, it seems like the Hindu religion is making a major renaissance in India. So number one, is that true? And then number two, if you look out over the next decade, is there any relationship to the Indian economic awakening?
So, I would argue that the Hindu religion is not making a renaissance in India. Yeah, and our current government would like to have it that way, and would like to place it at the heart of India's growth prospects in the next decades. But that's the view of the current government and its supporters. It's not necessarily the view of all of India. My own personal view is that one of the concerns I have is that should the Hindu religion play a bigger role in the country? By all means. Should it play a bigger role at the expense of other communities such as the Muslims? Not at all. And I'm a Parsi. We are under 100,000 people, and I've always made the argument that if you really upset the Parsis, it doesn't matter, because we don't figure in
But the
the
revenue per
numbers.
Parsi is very high.
But yeah, we're very highly productive. We're at the top end.
Exactly.
But is there anyone who thinks that India's prospects are better by disaffecting 200 million people, which is the Muslim population? It just cannot be.
If it's another difficult question, it goes to Naushad.
Naushad, exactly.
No. So I know you talked about the Tatas, but even in the US, while we talk about the conglomerates, but $10 trillion of manufacturing revenue comes from mid-size manufacturing. So what's your, I wouldn't call it secret sauce, but what's the direction you would give? Because it's skill, it's funding, and policy. Because that's where you will start seeing the growth. And in fact, the problem of the labor shortage that's happening in the US is majorly felt in the mid-size rather than the large.
So, some years ago at the India conference that was referred to, which used to take place in this room and in the Landau building next door, Anne Krieger, who was Jessica's predecessor, a few steps back, wrote a paper called India's Missing Middle. And it was all about the fact that if you look at the size distribution of Indian firms, you had very large numbers of small firms. And then you had a certain number of large firms, and you did not have enough mid-sized firms. The opposite of that is, if you like, Germany, where the Mittelstand or the mid-sized firms, largely family-owned, are the, in a sense, secret sauce of the German economy. And the strength of the German economy, these firms that have strong proprietary technology, decades of experience in investing in particular specialized sectors, and they dominate very often world markets for those specialized sectors as relatively small firms. It's always been my view and the view of some of my friends that the future of India should look like Germany, not like Korea with huge chaebol, or China with state-backed champions. It should look like Germany, with thousands and thousands of mid-sized, mid to large firms that develop strong proprietary capabilities in a bunch of different fields and operate in an open and competitive environment. That, it seems to me, is our future, and policy should support that kind of a industrial structure. Yeah.
So if this was an MBA class, it would be this time of the class that I'd look around and cold call on someone on their phone. So let's see if I can. No. In fact, I'll say, yeah, here we go. Thanks.
There's this cliche that Japan got rich and is now getting old. China is getting old before it gets rich. And India has this demographic dividend, and that's going to continue for 30 to 50 years. What is your thought about this demographic dividend that we have? Secondly, there's a thing that I see that Indian industries are doing with Tata, Lakshmi Mittal, Adani. They are buying companies outside. And do you see that they are trying to bring their management skills into these not so well-run companies outside? And is that going to work out well for these Tata buying Jaguar Land Rover or Adani or so forth,
Well, Tatas and Adani are very different examples in terms of their investments overseas, in terms of what they're actually after, I would say. But in terms of bringing those management capabilities to the firms they've bought, I think that's what they've tried to do. So remember, Tata's bought JLR from Ford, right, at a relatively good cost, £2 billion, I think, at the time, right? More pounds, dollars, I can't remember, but more or less the same.
They used to be very different.
They used to be very different,
Not
but now
anymore,
they
yeah.
So, and I think they've tried to bring their capabilities to nurturing JLR's innovative capabilities and so on. They also bought them at the right time, and Ford sold them at the wrong time, and that there was this nice series of new product launches that came out soon after the acquisition, which transformed JLR in the Tata Group. I mean, so it's become a very successful part of the group, a major success story as an acquisition, which is not to say that all of their acquisitions have been successful. Tata Steel, a few months before Tata Motors bought JLR, Tata Steel bought Chorus, and they've been struggling with that ever since in terms of the losses that it's delivered consistently over time.
Yeah, just in case anyone, JLR's Jaguar Land Rover. I mean, you see a lot of them around here.
Yeah,
They're like basically Indian-owned car companies.
Yeah, so I mean, so it depends, firms differ, right? I mean, that's the whole point. And they differ on the basis of management practices, and they differ also on the basis of luck in terms of what happens to them and if they happen to be in the right place at the right time with whatever product, et cetera, and capability one has. So we have all kinds of firms in India. We have, as the distribution shows, we have really well-managed firms and we have really badly managed firms and everything in between. So, yeah. Adani is a different story. I mean, it's a story of really trying to invest in particular infrastructure sectors where one can, to some extent, capture monopoly rents, whether it's in ports or it's in coal mining or it's in anything else.
Yeah, no, on the demographic dividend point, I feel like it is a daunting state that there is a huge underskilling problem in India. But I do think that the mindset has definitely shifted. Like over the last 10 years, there is this mindset that there's nobody from the outside coming in to help you. You kind of have to figure this out yourself and help yourself. And I do think that the way the public infrastructure has come in to actually be universally helpful, especially you look at UPI and Aadhaar and so on. Businesses are now getting built on these public rails. I'm actually very hopeful that that is the instrument by which you can actually get to a self-sustaining internal market, right? And that's kind of what you need to get rich before India gets old. It's not a given, but I think that investing in that public-private infrastructure is probably the second most important thing after education.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I'm glad you said after education.
After education, yeah.
Sorry, you've been having your hand up for a long time, yeah. So.
What are the factors responsible for one country's rapid growth versus another country's slow-moving growth? Now, at this point in China, it was just, they had no opposition, no competition from any countries. Now, India is facing competition from Vietnam, Malaysia, and all of the stuff. How much of that actually is reflected in India's not so rapid growth like China's?
I mean, the economist Jagdish Bhagwati had a great comment once where he said that, economic miracles are a public good. Every economist sees in them the fulfillment of their own policies. And it's and there's some truth in that, because I would argue that China had as tough an environment as India did. It's just that the competitors were different at the time. When China came into global manufacturing, it came into global manufacturing and was competing against Indonesia and Malaysia and Thailand. These were the three sort of countries that were kind of following the South Korea, Taiwan example. And they came in extremely successessively. Built scale, one could argue, with lots of government support and protection, and ended up eclipsing every other emerging economy. We have an opportunity again now because Chinese wages have risen as high as they have, and lower wage jobs are starting to move out in garments, in footwear, in food processing to some extent. And there is that opportunity again, I think, for any country that chooses to take it, and India should. So.
It's interesting. You answered the manufacturing story. I was going to think in tech that India's just kind of dominant.
Yeah, I think India is dominant in. I think India is fairly unique in the industry structure within tech, both in terms of the size of the developer population, as well as it's also English awareness. It's the ability to work with enterprises around the world. There's already a working relationship with enterprises around the world. So I don't think there is a competitor of a similar scale on the IT services front. And I think the second part, which is the India internal market, I think that is also a differentiator. So if you try to, most other countries that want to be export-led, they sort of they have a small internal market and they want to be export-led. But in India, there is a huge internal market and a huge, very aspirational middle class. Yeah. And so when it comes to manufacturing and so on, it doesn't have to be dependent on external demand. I think there is a lot of internal demand to service as well, which the Indian manufacturers are advantaged on that. So I would say it is different than some of these other economies.
So I was going to do something extremely radical. I don't think any Stanford professor has ever done that before, which is to actually end slightly early rather than run totally over. Although maybe that clock is wrong, so it's hard to tell. But this has been a fantastic panel. I've seen there's a great layout. I was walking on the way here. You've probably all seen it, of food and drink outside. So we'll be around. But yeah, thank you very much to Rohini, Naushad, and Megha for the great presentation and discussion.
Thank you.